I'm Erica Lynn, and we all know the ocean is the most demanding environment on Earth, consistently testing the reliability and durability of our equipment. When you spend as much time fishing as I do, you know that reliable gear is essential for staying on the water. This is why I went with the Abyss battery to power my trolling motor, electronics, and outboard. The guys at Abyss Battery are rattling the saltwater industry by manufacturing performance marine batteries specifically designed for sonar, outboards, trolling motors, and electronic fishing reels. They're also Bluetooth compatible, so I found checking battery statuses right on your phone while you're out on the water is a huge game changer. To learn more about why Abyss batteries are used by the pros and factory installed by premier boat builders, visit abyssbattery.com.
Fishing like a local isn't just about catching fish. It's about connecting with the environment and the people who call it home. It's about hearing the stories and traditions that have been passed down for generations and sharing unforgettable moments with the people you meet along the way. Fishing like a local is having an experience that stays with you forever. And with Fishing Booker, you can experience it too, no matter where you are. Discover your next adventure on Fishing Booker.
Hello and welcome to the Publicly Challenged Podcast. I'm your host, Luke Oswald, and I hope you join me on my quest for knowledge to become a better public land hunter, angler, and forager. Stick with this and who knows, maybe we will learn something together. All right, so I'm sitting here and I'm talking to Chris Gavin. And Chris, would you like to go ahead and introduce yourself for everybody listening?
Absolutely. I'm Chris Gavin. I am, I guess, something of a modern day hunter-gatherer. I try to hunt and gather most of my own food. And I met Luke at the Midwest Fall Harvest Festival here just a few months back. I don't remember, Luke, if we were you in my introduction to foraging class, or was it?
It was the
fire starting.
Fire starting. Yep.
Fire starting. So, yep, I'm trying to get into primitive skills and pass them on to folks.
I love it. I always feel like that's such a great way to, one, connect with people, especially if they're passionate about the same things you are. It makes it easier, and to be able to pass knowledge on that either they don't have or want to know more about, and you being able to, even if you're not, like, I'm not a master, or at least perceive myself as a master of anything. But at the same time, anything that I've learned and as a skill and I can give that to somebody and let them run with it, that's an amazing thing. So kudos to you for starting to do that and, pass on that knowledge, because that's a wonderful thing to do, because there's been so much that has been lost.
Yeah, for sure. And it's funny because I tend to kind of like project onto other people. I think we all do it to a degree. And, I oftentimes think that other people already know a lot of these skills, or if they're interested in them, they would have gone out and learned a lot of them. So, about I've had hints all along the way. In high school, I was raised in a family that went out canoeing in places like Boundary Waters and on the Wisconsin River and camping. And when my friends from the cross country team were like, "Hey, you know how to canoe? Can you take us out on Lake Wingra and in the Madison area?" And I'm like, "Sure." And we throw the canoes in the water and I start paddling, and they're all looking to me for instruction. I was dumbfounded. I was like, everybody knows how to canoe. If I know how to canoe, anybody can do it. And I've just picked up skills all along the way just because it fascinates me. And probably about 6 or 7 years ago, my wife turned to me and she said, people would pay you to like take them out into the woods and show them what they can eat, or show them how to read sign for deer hunting. And I was like, no, they wouldn't. But it turns out people will. So I started a business called Eagle Outdoor Skills, and still, even after I started the business and started teaching people classes, people come up to me and like, "Oh, do you teach fire making classes?" And I was like, well, I was just dismissive of the concept because I thought everybody knows how to start a fire. If you want to start a fire, you just watch a YouTube video if you don't know. But people want those skills and want that knowledge and want to see it done, in a personal fashion. So still to this day, people come to me and say, "Oh, do you know how to do X, Y, or Z?" And obviously, I still consider myself very much a student of life, and I'm still picking up skills that other people have been doing their whole lives. But I'm still finding things where people come up to me and say, "Oh, do you know about basket weaving?" And I'm like, "Sure, I do." And they're like, "Well, could you teach me?" I was like, "Hey, maybe I should offer a class in this because I forgot that I knew how to make baskets and that people might want to know how to do that." So that's kind of how my business started and is evolving. And of course, all the classes I do are through my business. Sometimes other people hire me to teach at their events, and then also sometimes it's through volunteer efforts. So I'm a scoutmaster here in the Madison, Wisconsin area, and I've found that to be really rewarding to reach out with youth and teach them skills that I consider to be really important.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's funny that you mentioned the basket weaving because I think I've made one basket in my lifetime. I'm pretty sure I was like maybe like 12 or 14, and it wasn't taught. I saw something and it was like I saw a basket and I'm like, I bet you I could do that. And so I actually pulled strips of bark and started weaving them together and actually made an actual basket out of it. I couldn't figure out the handle, um,
Yeah,
but
that's tricky.
I made the basket and I had it for a long, long time. And then I couldn't tell you where it went today, or probably got thrown out at some point along the way. But that was the only one I ever made. And now I'm kind of thinking to myself, maybe that wouldn't be a bad skill because you see people making baskets out of so many different things.
Oh
And,
yeah.
it's not just bark or it's strips of wood, that they actually, well, not so much anymore because there's hardly any black ash left. But
Yep.
they would use the strips of wood and weave together and make black ash baskets and different things like that. But like watching people make it out of fibers, different fibers and stuff, that is
Oh
something
yeah.
that just is like, what? So fascinating to me. And that's something I probably should dig more into. What's like your range of expertise when it comes to making baskets? What do you kind of utilize?
So I learned how to first make baskets at the House Folk School up in Grand Marais, Minnesota, probably about 15 years ago or so. And we were like taught the traditional Anishinaabe method of making black ash baskets. So we were out there wailing on a black ash log with aluminum baseball bats so that we could peel apart the annual growth rings and cut them into strips. So that was a really cool immersive way to learn how to do basket making. And since then, I've made some black ash baskets, but typically I will actually use a lot of invasive exotics that grow in my area for making my baskets. So I've done a lot of, well, willow's not so much an invasive exotic, but it's a resource that could just replenish itself really quickly. So I've made a few willow baskets. But I've done a lot with honeysuckle. And I've joked with friends that if I ever go into business making honeysuckle baskets, my tagline might be like committed to destroying the resource or something like
Nice. I
just
hate
wipe out all the honeysuckle.
honeysuckle so
Yeah.
bad, especially
Yeah.
when hunting. And I never knew this before, right? But once I discovered like how invasive it is, and you would see it and you'd go, man, sucks. I don't want to hunt that area, right? Because there's just
Mm.
so much honeysuckle. It's so thick.
So thick. Yep.
But didn't realize that it was invasive. And then once I learned that, it just like fueled the fire even more. And now I'll be sitting in a tree staring at certain patches of honeysuckle and just like angry, knowing it's shading out some native plant that no longer exists because of it in that region or that area that I'm in. And I'm like, oh, I just want to destroy it all. So that's an
Yeah.
awesome tagline.
Yeah, it's rough. I remember I've had that feeling before of just like almost seething at invasive exotics until I realized it's kind of like there's been a meme floating around online that lately that says, if you choose to be upset with the snow, you'll still have as much snow in your life, but you'll have less joy. So I'm not accepting of honeysuckle or buckthorn or garlic mustard on the landscape, but I've learned that if I rage against it, it doesn't actually help that much. So
Yeah.
with with the garlic mustard, that's just I just pull it and eat it as
Right.
much as I can. When I give foraging classes too, I often tell people, when you're looking at foraging, sustainability is going to be really important. I mean, sustainability is important with any natural resource endeavor, and it's a real spectrum out there. You've got something on one end of the spectrum like wild leeks or ramps, where you're typically going to want to harvest a small amount of the population, and then at the way other end of the spectrum, you've got garlic mustard, where even when I'm pulling garlic mustard to eat, I'm pulling like 6 times as much as I could possibly consume and just pinching off the best parts and putting the rest in a plastic bag so I'm making room in the forest for the things that ought to be there. So
Right. That's you know, and I'm not saying like I absolutely hate it, because they are plants and they all have a purpose. Just it makes me sad, I guess I should say, that there's other things that aren't there or I'm not going to be able to discover because of it. So I don't
oh
want
yeah,
to,
and
I like, and so I actually created a couple t-shirts that I haven't released yet, but it's like stop the hate type t-shirt, and then it's like dandelions and things like that, and it's I haven't quite refined the tagline, but it's going to be something like plants not weeds, or something like that. But
yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, it's rough too because I mean you have things like you just mentioned dandelions and those many people most people believe that they're something of an invasive exotic, but of course they only tend to invade golf courses and lawns, which that's a relatively depauperate ecosystem as it is. So I'm always glad to see them because it means that they're not spraying in that particular spot. So I feel free to forage there, and oftentimes I'm foraging the dandelions. But those others though, the honeysuckle and the buckthorn and the garlic mustard, that threat is quite real. I remember in a conservation biology class in college learning that the number one driver of extinction in our modern world is habitat loss, but number two in gaining fast was invasive species, and they'll displace the natives. And I took that class 15 plus years ago, so it could be that invasive exotics have already dethroned habitat loss as far as driving biodiversity loss. So it's definitely a real threat that we have to consider. And one of the neat things as a forager, and as it would happen as a basket maker who uses um, honeysuckle and some other things on occasion, but a lot of times the things that us foragers are out for in the landscape, a lot of them are invasive exotics. Many times they were brought over here, like garlic mustard, for example. There's a reason garlic mustard is here. It's a staple in Eastern European diets, and somebody brought it from the old world over here because they remembered it from their Polish grandmother's garden and planted it in their garden, and it got out and just grew all over the place. So, I mean, there's so many edibles out in the landscape that some of us know because they're edible, some of us know because they're our worst enemy in the garden, some of us know because we encounter them when we're deer hunting in the woods. But wild parsnip, garlic mustard, the list goes on and on for invasive exotics that came over here because people planted them in their gardens and they got out, went crazy.
yeah, that's it. You saying that just reminded me of a commercial I heard on the radio, on a local radio station the other day, and it's kind of like a rural radio station, so they have a lot of like farm commercials on it. And one of them, it was like a Halloween type setting, like a scary, spooky, and the guy's like, "Oh no, it's gonna invade my bean fields! Here it comes!" it's pigweed. And I'm like,
Oh
you
no.
have got to be kidding me. And then it's like, spray so and so on your fields to prevent the pigweed. And I'm thinking to myself, or you could just, maybe harvest it or not worry about it and take those seeds and make flour or whatever. I mean, I'm pretty sure
Yeah.
like a lot of indigenous cultures actually utilize that once they shifted towards a little bit of a modern farming aspect. Well, I guess for then modern farming, but they utilize plants like that and
Oh
use the
yeah.
seeds and stuff. So, I mean, it's definitely got a purpose. They're acting like it's some scary monster, and your common person that's never heard of it, and they hear that commercial, are like, "Oh, pigweed's horrible. Why would you,
Yeah.
And then there
Yeah.
it goes with that negative connotation, just like dandelions have gotten for so long.
Oh yeah, it's amazing how much a lot of these air quote weeds that we talk about are edibles. And I think I was reading one of Michael Pollan's books that it's no accident that a lot of these invasive exotics take over disturbed areas. When you look them up in the field guides, they'll say, where do you find them? Disturbed areas. Because a lot of these things like purslane, pigweed, lamb's quarters, a lot of them were semi-domesticated centuries, if not millennia ago. So a place like a garden or a farm field is really it's a natural habitat for them. So they'll grow readily in those areas. And I tend to take a dim view of how spray happy our culture has gotten, and how crazy our agriculture has gotten. um, but at the same time, my wife has a vegetable garden in the backyard, and I prefer to reap what I didn't sow. So I like to go out in the woods and forage, but she has all sorts of things popping up in her garden, and it causes a little bit of a war between us because she'll have purslane coming up and she'll want to weed it, and I was like, no, 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 let it get just a little higher, and then I swear I'll harvest it out. And she'll be like, okay, the lamb's quarters though over here, can you please like get to it, get taken care of? I'm like, oh, as soon as it gets just a little bit taller, and then I'll come and take it out. And if I don't take it out, then of course she's like, see, I told you it's taking over my tomato patch or something like that. so
I did the
so
same
she's
thing.
she's always telling me I've got to like stay on top of the weeds, and I'm always like, get a little bit bigger so I can then harvest them and pull them in. But then I usually try to turn around and make something for dinner, and that's how the piece is made. When I
Yeah.
make like ortopita with the lamb's quarters, or I put them in a salad or something like that, then I get back in her good graces
So
by
what was the dish? Tortopita?
ortopita. So
Ortopita.
yeah, that's a really cool. So horta, if you're familiar with spanakopita, a lot of people know spanakopita.
I
It's
don't
like a
know.
pie. It's phyllo dough with um, feta cheese and spinach in it. That's spanakopita. It's Greek for spinach pie. Hortopita means herb pie, and it's kind of interesting because when you're getting into like wild foods, oftentimes people will say, well, where do you find the recipes for this stuff? And I'd say, oftentimes, if you look at cultures that still have recipes that just say greens or herbs in their name, that's a really helpful hint for a recipe that'll lend itself to just throwing in a whole bunch of wild foraged greens. And horta is a really great example of this because horta in Greek just means herb. So if you go out with a Greek friend and you're like, what's horta? I want to know the plant horta. The guy or the lady might point at a dandelion and say, that's horta. And you're like, oh, horta, that's Greek for dandelion. And then he'll turn around and say, that's horta. And he'll point at like lamb's quarters. And you're like, but you just said that the dandelion is. It's like, no, no, it's all horta. Horta is like any herb you can eat. And in English, we've kind of moved away from that a little bit. I mean, herb used to have that meaning, and these days, typically, it seems like herb is used as either a medicinal or a spice.
Right.
Um, Occasionally, in some of the older field guides, like Ewell Gibbons and whatnot, you'll see the term pot herb. And pot herb is kind of this idea of some green that you just kind of throw into the pot. but you don't tend to see that term much in like the Better Homes and Gardens or the Betty Crocker cookbooks.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
but another, like if you look in Indian food, like from the subcontinent of India, saag means greens. So a lot of recipes, like a lot of people know panak paneer, which is it's a spinach and cheese, but saag paneer just means greens and cheese. Or sansai is Japanese for I think it literally translates to the greens or the plants that grow in the mountains. The idea meaning that out past the arable land, where you have your garden and your farm field, the plants that grow out in the mountains are the ones you forage and then put into meals. So
Interesting. So you read a little bit of history and definitely into the cuisine of different cultures as well, huh?
oh yeah, I mean one has to, and you know, I guess it's part of my nature perhaps, but you know, these things, it's like an ecosystem. These things are all so interconnected. The food we eat, where it comes from, the cultures behind it. There's so many different touching points. I mean, I'm kind of one of those people who will intend to look up something on Wikipedia and like 2 hours later, like, you know, 10 p.m. And, you know, I meant to look up, you know, some obscure fact about white-tailed deer, and now I'm like learning about Gila monsters in the American Southwest or something like that. So it it is partly my nature, but it serves me well in the kitchen, at least.
Yeah, for sure. So I've seen your Instagram, and it's definitely mostly all food, as far
Yeah.
as that goes. But it looks good. Most of it's wild cuisine, so that's cool. You're trying to
Oh,
use a
there's a
lot of
story.
resources, you know.
Yeah, there's a story behind that too, because I used to tell people that I'm not the kind of that I would never be the kind of person to Instagram their meals or put that thing on Facebook. And then the funny thing happened is the pandemic struck, and I got bored, and I started Instagramming my meals. And this is like stuff I've been eating, you know, for years now. And I, at first, yeah, as a Midwesterner, I was also like, oh, this will look like bragging. And I was like, I don't care, I'm bored. And I just started throwing stuff up online, and the feedback has really been very positive, though. You know, people ask me for recipes, and if I have the time, I'll share the recipes. And, you know, for me, wild foods is all about living closer to the land. So if I can either through my classes or through my social media posts, you know, encourage other people to eat wild foods, then they'll form these new relationships with the plants and animals out on the landscape. And I'm a firm believer that these connections and relationships that people will form then with these plants and animals and fungi will lead to people wanting to protect them and have a deeper understanding for them. So, you know, when I give my classes, I always end by talking about how, you know, I might be out here giving people this knowledge, but really at the end of the day, I sleep better at night knowing that I've shared information about the natural world that's caused people to form a more intimate connection with the landscape. And, you know, with my foraging classes, you know, when you're talking about taking a piece of something from nature and putting it in your mouth and making it part of your body, it doesn't, most relationships don't come in a more intimate form than that. And, you know, when I facilitate that sort of relationship forming between people and plants, or people and other animals, or people and fungi, then I don't have to worry about how they're going to vote when they go to the polls and there's a referendum for, you know, protecting a green space. Or I don't have to worry about you know, how they're going to see some initiative put forth by their local or state or even federal government. You know, something like what's the new bill it's in Washington right now that I'm hoping gets passed, the Recover America's Wildlife Act, I think.
Ooh, I don't know.
That one is,
I know
I
there's a
think.
couple bad ones that are trying to eliminate hunting in different forms and stuff like that, especially like Washington and Oregon trying to eliminate bear hunting, New Jersey all kinds of stuff like that. I'm not sure though. There's so much stuff out there anymore, and I'm going to be honest, I've almost completely tuned out from it and
Uh,
become like uh, anti-political anymore. Not that I was ever like super political before, but I've just got such a disgust, and the more time I spend in nature, the further away I want to get from, you know, that part of the world as far as, my space, that it doesn't even enter my bubble anymore. And there's some different gun laws and things going on right now that I haven't even paid attention to. And normally I'm pretty on top of that, but anymore, man. And it's like you said though, that nature, the relationship, that bond that you build with it. Um, it's kind of crazy because if somebody would have told me that wasn't really a forager other than like 2 years ago, that now these are more than just weeds. They're plants. They're your friends. They can heal you. They can provide for you. You can eat these. This tree. And the thing is I had a relationship, right? As a hunter, you have that relationship, but it's not fully developed because there's a disconnect. There's a disconnect between our food, our relationship, the spirituality, all these different things. All of that seems severed these days. And now, I mean, they're raising meat in labs in petri dishes and trying to feed that to people, even though it's cells, that they took from an animal or whatever. I mean, if you want to talk about a disconnect that people have, that's it right there. That's
oh yeah.
missing the whole meaning of whether or not you believe in, which is crazy because almost all cultures believe in a creator, whether it's Sky Mother, whether it's, God, whether whoever it is, they believe in a creator. And that creator tailored these things for us. And to like completely deny that, I have a hard time with people doing that because they clearly haven't spent enough time in it, immersing themselves in it, I think. And then, but that relationship and taking that food and having it become part of your body, that's the truth. And so many people don't do that they don't care or don't notice it. And I had an experience which I shared on one of my episodes, but that was the first time I ever talked about it. But out foraging, looking for mushrooms, I was looking for hen of the woods, didn't find any at the moment, see a puffball. I was like, oh, cool. Went to go grab it. It was well past expired. And I was like, oh, well, you know what? Nature will provide. That was my mindset and my attitude. And as soon as I
Yep.
said that to myself and turned around, boom, there was like 20 different puffballs all over the place. Picked a couple of those and said, I'm going to explore another area that I haven't been into, but I know it's got a lot of mature oaks. And sure enough, guess what? There was perfect size hens that weren't buggy, had just
Mm.
popped. They were, like just the right size, a couple handfuls. Picked those like ones you barely even need to clean because you don't have to worry. You can rinse them. You don't have
Oh
to
yeah.
soak them, and
Yep.
ended up finding like six of those on one tree, on one oak tree. And at that moment, I put my hand on the tree and I actually even took a picture of because I was like, people aren't going to believe me like unless I take this picture and explain the story. And at that moment, I thanked that tree. And I was like, you do more for me than I could ever do for you. You allow me to hunt out of it. You feed the animals around me. You provide this relationship with this fungi that also produces fruit. And all of these things are because you're here. What could I ever do for you? And most people don't have that mindset because they haven't been there. They haven't put themselves in that experience. It's crazy. It's crazy that we
Yeah.
got away from that.
Yeah, yeah, we definitely yeah, I think uh even your average outdoors person, I don't think spends enough time outdoors, and the rest of us, really need to get out there because I mean there's so many different paths forward too. When I'm giving my foraging classes, I oftentimes I just can't help myself. I will talk about because everything's so interrelated that it'll naturally come up that I'm a hunter and that I hunt for food. And I've had people in my classes say, "Oh, well, you must really like vegans must drive you crazy then." And I'm thinking, not at all, not at all. I mean, I've heard lots of vegetarian and vegan arguments about just living more lightly on the earth, and I know a lot of foragers who are vegetarian or vegan, and it's like, hey, we're all on different paths, but moving in the right direction. So, as long as people are getting out there and experiencing it and know where their food comes from, because I've also met vegetarians that, have no idea where their food's coming from. And, if it's a soybean farm being in the industrial model that's being sprayed, it's like, I tend to think that venison might be a little bit better for the environment than your average soy burger. And then at the same time, my own logic comes right around to bite me in the butt because where I hunt, I'm pretty sure that most of the deer have been eating soybeans from the
Yes.
kids too. So, I'm eating some agriculturally subsidized venison. When the does come in and they've got that little dimple right in the middle of their back because they've got so much fat on them that I make soap out of deer fat. And here in Wisconsin's driftless area, there's a couple of deer where it's I take them and I'm skinning them, and the fat that's underneath, I'll make more than a year's supply of soap for myself, my friends, my family, off of just one deer because there's some well-fed corn-fed does roaming around here. So it's one of those things where everything's just so interconnected. It's fascinating to me to get out there and see that, like your story about the oak and the matakes. So, that doesn't even like touch on the acorns that could be harvested, or the acorns that the squirrels could harvest, and then you shoot the squirrels.
Yeah.
So
And the
eat the
deer
squirrel.
and everything
So
else. And providing me a place to kill
everything,
the deer. So it's
everything,
full
yeah.
circle and everything is connected, and people just
Yep.
don't realize that anymore. But what I find fascinating is you talking about the soap. I've always wanted to do that, and I've had some deer that, no joke, had like a 1 inch fat cap on them, just
Yep,
throughout
that's
the
that's what
whole
I'm talking
back, and the
about.
hind quarter might even be thicker than that, and it's like,
Yep.
whoa. But so many times I've taken the tallow and put it in the freezer, and it's like, and then I never end up doing that with it. Sometimes I've done some other stuff, tried the whole chapstick thing with the
Yep.
beeswax and stuff like that, but never did the soap. But one of the things that you talked about was, you're eating the deer with the soy, that's probably eating the soy. I mean, that's anything. And you see all these people talking about, oh, yeah, organic, meat flown in fresh this morning because I dropped this duck, right? And it's like, no, buddy, I guarantee you that duck's probably hit every cornfield from, Canada all the way down here. So there's no way
Yep.
it's full of more GMOs than probably a duck that you could raise on your own property.
Yep. Yep. I think a few years back, in Wisconsin, they just recently proposed a sandhill season. And it's interesting because I give tours for probably, wow, last almost 15 years. I've got a very part-time job giving tours at Elda Leopold's shack near Baraboo, Wisconsin. And when we go down to the Wisconsin River there's almost always a bunch of sandhill cranes there. And in one of Elda Leopold's essays called Marshland Elegy, he talks about how even if cranes are not like a keystone species, if they disappear from a wetland, something like just spiritual in nature is lost, and it's different. And a lot of people who read that passage these days think he was talking about whooping cranes, because they're so endangered. But in his day, he was talking about any cranes, sandhill cranes. I think when he was professor of wildlife ecology at UW-Madison, there was like 42 breeding pairs of sandhill cranes in the whole state of Wisconsin. And now they're just all over the place, to such an extent that tying it in with our conversation about wildlife eating corn, the farmers have recently had to treat their corn with a substance that's distasteful to cranes because as they're planting it, the cranes are following tractors around, eating eating the seed corn. And then I think it was about 2 or 3 years ago there was a hunt um, proposed through the legislature here in Wisconsin, and I've heard compelling arguments, mostly centered around how at dawn and dusk, when your best chances for hunting a whooping crane and a sandhill crane. One's gray and one's white, but at first light, everything's kind of gray. So there's concern about whooping cranes getting incidentally taken if we have a sandhill season. I've heard animal rights groups talk about how it's like the state peace symbol, which for me is a less compelling argument. I've heard people say, well, why would you ever hunt such a thing? It's just this long, gangly bird. But when you sink a fillet knife into the breast muscles, it just keeps going deep in there, and you peel it back and you see how dark that meat is, and it's like the classic ribeye of the sky that we all know of. We've heard that phrase before, but it's like the dark meat that tastes like beef, but the fat is like greasy. It's like a cheeseburger or something. It's just so
like a burger cooked in duck fat or something.
Yep, exactly. But for me, one of the coolest things is, if you're like, hey, I really don't think we should be hunting these for, various different reasons, or if you think, hey, we really should be hunting these things for various different reasons, I'm just pleased as punch that we can be having this conversation, because as recently as the 60s and 70s in Wisconsin, this was not a conversation to be had because there weren't enough cranes to support a hunt. So no matter where you fall on the should we or should we not have a sandhill crane season in Wisconsin, I think it's really cool that we're like, this is a conversation we can have. Same thing with timber wolves. I've heard a lot of people say, no, there's no good wolves, but a dead wolf. And I've heard people say, hey, we need to protect them all until they make it right down to your neck of the woods, Luke. I mean, I've heard people say that, they used to be in Illinois, so shouldn't.
They did. In fact, I have friends that have.
After years of fine print contracts and getting ripped off by overpriced wireless providers, if we've learned anything, it's that there's always a catch. So when I heard that for a limited time, all Mint Mobile wireless plans are $15 a month when you purchase a 3-month plan, I thought, what's the catch? But after talking to them, it all made sense. There isn't one. Mint Mobile's secret sauce is that they sell wireless service online. They cut out the cost of retail stores and pass those sweet savings directly to you. All plans come with high-speed data and unlimited talk and text delivered on the nation's largest 5G network. To get this new customer offer, go to mintmobile.com/waypoint. $45 upfront payment required, equivalent to $15 a month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes on unlimited plan. Additional taxes, fees, and restrictions apply. See Mint Mobile for details.
Seen some in Illinois, not in recent years, but it was kind of hush-hush, but I believe that the Department of Natural Resources actually may have released a small, breeding pair or two to keep wildlife in check in a few areas that aren't too far from me, and it was not known about.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm not saying impossible at all. Don't get me wrong. It's just it sounds like I run into some old school hunters who are like, oh, the DNR is releasing rattlesnakes to control the turkey population.
This was a fenced-in area. It was a completely fenced-in area, but over the years, kids and stuff have cut fences to go sneak into there and party and do other things. So I'm not 100% ruling it out, because the person that told me is a very reliable source that they've physically seen it. And I'm like, sure it wasn't a coyote? And he's like, a coyote and a timber wolf look nothing alike. So, so I can't really argue with him on that, but not knowing fully, I can't say, but I've heard some talk of that almost would make me believe it, because I've heard other people saying it besides the person that told me that they saw one that never said the stories of them releasing it. So it's a possibility,
Stranger things have happened.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I tend to. It's funny because like we were talking slightly about politics earlier, and I'm politically all over the board.
Well,
All my liberal friends think I'm conservative. All my conservative friends think I'm liberal. I usually just say that there's never a position on any topic so lonely as one that starts out, well, it's complicated. So I tend to think that wildlife management done through the federal and state governments has been wildly successful in this country. I mean, the North American model of wildlife management has really done a lot of great things. It's definitely made some missteps along the way, and oftentimes the government is the last ones to admit that they've made a mistake along the way. But
yes.
yeah.
They have been quite successful at reintroductions of a lot of different species. I mean, look at the black bear, for instance. It was completely eradicated from Oklahoma and Arkansas, and that's one of the greatest success stories. I mean, you talk to somebody like Clay Newcomb, and he'll tell you all about it, and that it's one of the greatest reintroductions that's ever happened. And it's true. I mean, you look at numbers, and they're strong, and everybody's able to go and hunt them. In fact, I believe when you buy your hunting license and you buy your tags with your hunting license, a bear tag is included with your deer tags. So, I mean, that right there tells you that that's a success story within itself, that people almost hunted it to extinction, or actually did hunt it to extinction. And it was such a part of a staple of their culture in Arkansas for such a long time. And then it's eradicated, and here it is. It's back again, and it's thriving. I mean, granted, there's quite a few people that don't hunt anymore compared to numbers back then. But once again, different lifestyle, right? We've gotten away from that. But I'd love to see, and a lot of people argue with me on this one, but I'd love to see as many people as I can get into hunting, because that's more voices we have to protect animals and have those resources to fight for things that we need, and to fight for things that we need to take care of. And they say to me, like, well, what happens when there's X amount of, numbers, or there's too many hunters? I said, well, we'll address that problem when we get to it. But I feel like we're never going to get there. I mean, unless it's some apocalyptic scenario where all of a sudden everybody starts hunting, and then they wipe out animals. I don't really foresee that happening. I'd be more worried about like the doings of modern agriculture and man, and what they're doing, like you said about the treating the corn. What long-term effects is that having? What's the stuff they're putting on the corn that makes it taste bad? Could it be long-term carcinogen? Is it going to be something that, eventually wipes out the population of the cranes, the sandhill cranes anyway, and we just don't know it yet? I mean, these are all things that, run through my mind more so than people going out and sticking an arrow in something, or shooting a shotgun at it.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I'm also a big fan on taking people out into the woods and or showing them how to hunt, or turning people on. There's that classic venison diplomacy concept of one of the things I like to do with my meals that I post on social media is show people that venison can look really tasty. It can look appealing, and I should know, because the things I was doing to venison 15, 20 years ago when I first started hunting, I mean, it was a sin against meat and man. I would overcook my venison,
Wrapping it in bacon.
all sorts of stuff,
That one.
all sorts of stuff. I wish that wrapping it in bacon was how I started off mistreating venison. I would, back in the day when I was like, oh, food safety, I've got to cook everything thoroughly, and before I realized that, venison is best rare. And then once I realized it was best rare, then I only knew to serve it rare. It took a few more years before I was like, oh, or just braise the bejesus out of it. And then, that's a really great way to serve up venison too. I was, back, so I'm an adult onset hunter. I was raised in a family where, butter knives were almost too dangerous for kids to play with. So the idea that my folks were going to let me go out and hunt with my grandpa for deer was like, how about not this year? So I didn't really have any idea of like what it took to shoot my own food. It wasn't until I completely broke those chains. And after graduating high school, I went off into the Marine Corps. And at that point, my parents were not about to try to control what access I had in terms of weaponry and whatnot. But when I came back after the Marine Corps and felt much more confident around firearms and everything, I looked up my grandpa and I was like, I think I'm ready to go deer hunting with you. And that's how I got into hunting. I started big. A lot of people start off in their as a youth or in their teens squirrel hunting, and move up to bigger things. I started with deer in my early 20s and have worked to smaller things really. Though I definitely keep venison on the menu. It's the main staple really in our household. Um, but I really think it's important to get people out into the woods. I know very few people who go through that experience of spending that much time in the woods and actually harvesting an animal that are not then converted to seeing that how they are becoming a natural part of the ecosystem at that point, and not just some I'm here and that's over there. I'm living in a house and that's a forest or a farm field out there that is divorced from me, and I just go to the grocery store and buy pork or turkey or something all ground up in a styrofoam package. I think people feel so much more connected to the landscape when they do things like go hunting and or make baskets or even start a fire, a campfire, or in places like where we live, Luke, fire was actually part of the landscape before Europeans came and tended to suppress fire,
Yeah.
regular fire schedule. But you go see a burned out prairie or burned out oak savanna, and you can just be like, wow, fire is just it's also part of the ecosystem. And if there aren't enough lightning strikes in the tall grass prairie region of the upper Midwest to maintain prairies and savannas. So we know from historical record that that's a very anthropogenic ecosystem. That was humans living in concert with their environments, causing fires to burn so that the habitat would favor tasty things, plants, animals, fungi. White-tailed deer and wild turkey are edge specialists, that they really like that interface between forest and field or prairie or savanna type ecosystems. It's funny because in a place like Wisconsin, people are like, "Oh, go up to the Northwoods. That's where the deer hunting's at," and that's a total accident of history. Because when European Americans came into places like Illinois and Wisconsin, it was like, "Hey, tons of white-tailed deer. Set up a farm, start farming, kill the deer, free venison, market hunting, and no
Yep.
regulation." And in short order, they wiped out all the deer. And then the robber barons came into the Northwoods and logged it out. And areas that were not good whitetail habitat at all were suddenly great whitetail habitat at just the right moment when there wasn't any deer left in places like Illinois or southern Wisconsin. And all of a sudden, this tradition of people from Milwaukee or Chicago or Madison driving all the way up to the Northwoods where all the deer were, a whole 2-3 generations just had that in their mind that that's what you do. You go from where there's no deer in places like southern Wisconsin, Illinois, Iowa, and you go up to places like Minnesota and northern Wisconsin, and you go deer hunting there. And then, of course, the secondary growth starts coming in, and it turns out it's not as great whitetail habitat as it used to be. And at the same time, game regulations and an end to market hunting means we have not just the white-tailed deer we had before in places like Illinois and Iowa and Wisconsin, but I mean, you know how it is. You could hardly invent better whitetail habitat than what we've got in the farm fields and forest lots of southern Wisconsin, yeah. Illinois, and Iowa.
Yeah.
I mean, it's
one of the things I see now, though, is the destruction of the tree lines. I mean, the passageways that these deer used to take or pheasants. Like you don't see a wild pheasant anymore, and it's to get in, 5 extra rows of corn and then
Yeah.
have all that erosion at the same time. It's like, is it really worth it? And I think most of it boils down to the fact that the people who own their own land aren't doing that. It's the ones who are leasing it, get them to agree to let them put in, a few extra rows of corn by destroying that habitat. And in turn, now those Osage rows are gone. And then you're getting, if they let it grow back up, it's honeysuckle and other things like that. But,
Mm.
it's a vicious
Yeah.
cycle. And, you know, and, the greedy white man after the billfold is what it's all about,
Yeah. And this is,
killing
I
the
mean, it's
great
the
white
same reason.
buffalo.
Yeah, it's the same reason why we don't have bobwhite quail in the numbers that we used to in the upper Midwest. And I do feel a lot of sympathy for the modern farmer, because I think even people who are working their own land, they're stuck with prices that are set. I mean, these prices are set by the market, and they've got to compete with other farmers for just getting as much crop as they can onto the marketplace. And the more other farmers are putting their product on there, it'll, I think the economics of it,
Yeah.
farmers who are living close to the land and probably would love to have hedgerows that support wildlife, it causes them to have to rely on the latest methods to get maximum yields out. At least that's my understanding of it. I cannot even begin to pretend to come in here and talk about agricultural.
Agricultural economics.
Yeah, yeah. If I'm not mistaken, I'm supposed to be talking about starting fires.
Well,
So,
yeah. So, it's funny though, because like I feel like my life was a little bit different than yours, like growing up, but like you're more advanced now with the skills than that, where I'm at. But like when I was a kid, it was kind of free reign, and I may have contributed to a few uh, controlled slash uncontrolled burns and other things in my day. And knives were commonplace. There were stitches many a times and different things along the way. Pretty much had free reign to do whatever I wanted within reason, as long as I wasn't harming someone else. My
yep.
scars are my scars, but it was, and like the whole hunting thing though, like I did not have, like my dad would take me out occasionally. I think maybe like once or twice I went squirrel hunting with them. Um, Rabbits a couple times, and then it was mostly pheasants, like upland game. Um, but other than that, like the whole deer hunting thing, I started when I was 16, so I was kind of later in life, but I had no mentor, and it was just winging it, me and my buddies not knowing, going out with a bow and thinking we were gonna, take a deer. And I think it was like 4 years before I took my first deer with archery equipment, and it was all on my own, and it was a great moment, and doubled up on that morning, and it was awesome. But like that was the first experience, if I remember correctly, that was a culmination. But it was, I think, that solidified my experience. I'm not saying like mentors are a great thing, because there's many times where I wanted to put the bow down and not do it, but I'd have a buddy that'd be like, "Come on, let's go out," and then you do it and go out and struggle, and just, I mean, blown opportunities, and not knowing about wind, and not really even knowing the species. But now it's like there's so much information out there. If you don't look something up and you have questions about it, that's on you. There is no excuse other than the fact that you don't truly want to know. But but a mentor is a
Yeah.
great thing.
Oh, is it ever? And it's interesting because, like you said, Luke, there are a lot of great resources out there, but also with so many resources, it becomes a little bit tricky. In my foraging classes, I oftentimes talk about like, oh, you should get this book or that book. Definitely, follow this author. And there's not a lot of really bad authors out there, but when you start looking at like social media, it can be really useful. there's lots of knowledgeable people out there that are just itching to properly identify a mushroom that you put a picture on online. And there's also some people there that'll just throw out their best guess, and if it can be really hard to tell what stranger knows their stuff and what stranger doesn't know their stuff on a place like social media. So yeah, a trusted mentor can be really important. I happen to be incredibly lucky that I started deer hunting a few years before my grandfather passed away. So that was my window in. I don't know if I ever would have really gotten into hunting if I hadn't had that opportunity. But there are definitely skills that I do try to pick up without a mentor. So things I've decided to try to just teach myself, and sometimes a YouTube video can be a lot of help, and sometimes nothing but just getting out there
Yeah.
and like the first time I started a fire with a bow drill, I was just like, I had a vague inkling from books I had read and whatnot, but it would have been nice to have somebody over my shoulder say, no, no, keep going a little bit longer because you've almost got it. Because starting a fire with a bow drill, at least your first few times, it's a skill that is it's very easy to be like, I've got to be doing something wrong here. When you're doing everything right, you just have to keep drilling on. So yeah,
That's like when me and one of my buddies, we were kids, and so the Army Field Manual on Survival, right? Like,
oh yeah,
love
the
that book.
classic.
Just the greatest thing ever. I can't even remember what it is, 2176 or something like that. FM 2176. But my dad gave that book to me. I was like 10, I think maybe. And that was like my Bible. Dude, I would read that thing. I'd lay in bed every night and look at that thing and like, oh yeah, this is how you skin out a deer. Oh look, this is how you make a deadfall, or whatever.
Yep,
But then,
yep.
like, and then I got to the fire chapters, and like looking at it, me and my buddies, we tried it so many times, a friction fire with a hand drill or a bow drill, and we were never successful. But looking back now, as I know more and doing it, it's like,
Mm.
oh, we were using the wrong materials,
Yeah.
too hard of a piece of wood, like trying to use a piece of
Yep.
oak for your base, things like that. But I mean, we would get things where it would be smoking and stuff like that, but just never have full success of getting that ember, but just looking back, it's pretty cool to see like the stuff we used to try and do and were unsuccessful. But I mean, we'd go nuts for 3-4 days trying to do it. It's just
Yep.
fun.
Yep. Of course, those stories are so great too, because then when you're mentoring somebody else, you can be like, oh, don't go ahead and give this a try for a few minutes, but don't try it for the 4 days that I tried to do it, or yeah, don't track a deer off in that direction. You're never gonna get anywhere. So
Yeah,
yeah.
the best thing I learned is be friends with a person that has a tracking dog, an actual
Oh,
tracking dog. That's like the greatest resource ever as far as deer
oh
hunting and
yeah.
tracking an animal.
How do you feel great on vacation? Like really good? Easy. You go to Aruba. You'll spend your time relaxing on cool white sand beaches and floating in healing blue water. You'll immerse yourself in natural wonder and find your center on an island where things move at your speed. You won't just feel great, you'll feel relaxed, renewed, and ready for life. That's the Aruba effect. Plan your trip at aruba.com.
So, one of the things I wanted to ask you was you mentioned earlier about the tallow soap, and I've never actually made it.
Yeah.
I've read about it and stuff. So I'm just kind of curious, like, how far do you go and do you get involved? Do you use like campfire ash or, like wood ash to make your own, like essentially, I guess, lye? Or what do you do and how do you go about it?
Yeah, I have used my own homemade lye one time, and the product didn't turn out that great. I think that was about the second or third time that I ever made soap. So, gosh, going back I think I've been making soap for about 13 years or so. And as many of us deer hunters know, um, the the taste of deer tallow. It's an acquired taste,
Right.
to say the least. It's an incredibly saturated fat, so it's prone to feeling waxy as soon as it hits your tongue. So, hunting deer that had a lot of fat on them, I wanted to make use of it, and I picked up a really good book a long time ago, long enough ago that Borders bookstore was still around. So I'm dating myself there, but that's where I picked up a book by, I think it was Dennis Walrod, on making the most of your deer, and
I
and
have
that
that
book
book.
had that is such a good book. I still reference the chart in there for like how long to age my deer depending on the temperature and everything, and that was the book that I first used to like learn the very basics for butchering deer as well. And there was a chapter in there on making soap, and I thought, I'll give this a go. And my first time I made soap, it was a little bit of a misadventure. I made it really thin. Like you're supposed to cure soap and let it set up, and nice and slow. And I put it in a jelly roll dish, so it cooled off really fast, and some of the lye separated out. And I being a novice at making soap, I had no idea that it was lye that I was looking at, not water. So I cut up the soap and I was using it, and I was noticing that I was getting like a mild chemical burn,
Oh, no.
just on highly sensitive spots. It was just enough lye left over that it was like a mild irritation in highly sensitive spots, and so that was a learning curve right there. And then the next year I made it and it turned out really well. And both those times I bought lye just straight from the hardware store, the kind that you use to clear drains and whatnot. I think it was my third time that I tried making, like I put hardwood ash into a hopper that was lined with newspaper and poured water over it, and it got the lye solution out. But the problem with that is it's really hard to figure out the concentration of your lye solution there. So my soap didn't turn out all that well that time, and I was also new at soap making, so it was a little hard to tease apart like if it was my technique that was off or if it was the lye that was off. But I just went back to the tried and true, and have ever since then just bought lye from the store, because when you have, I mean, I've made 20-pound batches of soap before off of deer. If it's, one of those seasons where I get two or three just really big does, that have a nice layer of fat on the rump. And it's not something that, when you honor the resource, I don't like to play around and be like, oh, well, that didn't work, so I'll just toss that batch. So I decided to not mess with success. And since my second batch worked so well, on my fourth batch, I just went back to making it with the lye from the hardware store, and that's what I've used ever since. I've tweaked it out a little bit here and there. I've put in some like essential oils of fir tree, and wintergreen in there to kind of give it some like foresty smells. I've made pine tar soap, which you put a little bit of pine tar in with your fat, and that makes for a really good shaving bar. You can use that. I've been using that for years and years for all my shaving needs. So I've made soap, and I haven't bought store-bought soap for many, many years. It's interesting because I taught my wife how to make soap, probably about 10 years ago, and she doesn't tend to make it out of deer tallow. She makes it out of olive oil or coconut oil, or anything that strikes her fancy at the grocery store. But then she's gone on to teach friends of hers how to make soap, and they're making soaps that mine just looks like, it just looks so normal and plain. It's just these like light brown bars that they kind of smell like fresh baked bread from when I'm rendering out the fat. That it just gets a little bit of those browning chemicals going on there as I melt down the fat. But they're doing stuff like color swirls in it and all sorts of stuff. So it's it's one of those like the student has become the master, and I'm just sitting there making plain unscented or pine tar bars of deer tallow soap, and they've taken it to the next level. So, and that's really cool to see. Not this past year, but the year before at the Midwest Fall Harvest Festival, I taught a class on making soap with deer tallow, and it wouldn't surprise me if a few people in that class are already becoming masters at the craft. Where I feel like I've plateaued with a utilitarian bar that is unscented that I wash with before I go out into the woods to hunt deer.
I
So
mean, what better
completing
to
the
wash with
cycle,
than the deer itself, right? So,
right? Yeah, there's something really poetic about it.
no, that's perfect.
Yep.
So, like for the essential oils and stuff, did you make your essential oils, or was it something that was like purchased, or how'd you go about
Uh,
that?
yeah, that's a great question. I have purchased essential oils, and I have also put balsam for pitch, just a little bit into a bar. I didn't want to put in too much because I wasn't kind of sure how that would play with the tallow, and it didn't really give it a whole lot of scent either. So that particular batch was perfectly fine for soap, but I couldn't really pick up on the scent. When I scent soap, I usually buy essential oils.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't
Yep.
like because to make essential oils, you need a ridiculous amount of whatever plant you're utilizing, right? I mean, it's like a ridiculous amount.
It's a process that I'm not terribly familiar with. I've heard a number of my herbalist friends say that the stuff you buy at the store for the most part should only be used very in very limited quantities and never internally because of the strength of it.
Right.
So
Right.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And then of course you could infuse oil, and it just makes me think like when you're making soap, say you utilize olive oil, if you infuse the olive oil before you did it with like yarrow and then something that had like a wonderful scent as well, might be kind of an interesting approach to making the soap. Now that you bring that
Oh,
up.
for sure. For sure. Yeah, I've made lip balm before, and I've never done that with deer tallow. I've always used olive oil, but I've infused that with like the ester of wintergreen.
Nice. Yeah.
So yeah,
Fresh
make a
on
little lip
those
balm.
chapped lips.
Yep, yep.
One of the other things I was going to ask you was like plant families. What's your favorite and kind of why?
Luke, that's gonna be too hard. That's so
Because I don't have a
it's
particular one because every season provides something different for me. But
it, exactly, and for me, it's like that almost, but in spades, because every day, it's something different. Oftentimes whatever plant it is that I'm like learning about or just discovered. I remember one time I was bringing a picture of a plant to a friend of mine, Sam Thayer, and he took a look at it and he's like, "That's the most exciting plant I've seen all month." And I was like, "Well, what is it?" He's like, "I don't know. That's what's so exciting about it." He was just super jazzed that it's like, I don't know what that is. It's funny because I ended up looking it up, and I think it was a speedwell. It was in the Veronica genus, and I checked out some ethnobotanical information on it, and it said that it was used to treat deer sickness, which is apparently a malady that one gets from eating too much venison. So
hmm,
I haven't had a chance to try it out, but I had two new goals in life after reading that. One was to eat enough venison to see if deer sickness is actually a thing, and then two was to see if this Veronica species would actually like help out with that situation if it's a real thing. So yeah.
that's
Plant families that are almost my favorite. I'm a real big fan of sassafras. I love sassafras. So that's one of my favorite plants. Not a family, but
right.
just a particular plant. Um, the conifers, the pine family. That's going to be way up there because they please the eye in the middle of winter. They're just always there for you and so useful too. You can make infusions with the needles to get some vitamin C, or you can flavor salts or sugars with the needles, and you can do that any time of year. That's always a nice thing, too. One of the wonders and joys of foraging is that it's so seasonal, and you like just there's something magical about knowing that this is it. You got to grab this thing right now, because there's mushrooms you can dry, but then there's also mushrooms that they don't really like to be dried that
Right.
well. They don't work that well, so you got to get it while you can. And then there's those other plants that are they're kind of nice, because once you really get into the foraging lifestyle and you acknowledge and enjoy the fact that things are so highly seasonal, there's also something special about those ones that you can kind of find whenever you want, and you can just go out to them, and so juniper berries or pine needles are going to be amongst that group, ones you can find when you really need them, even if you're negligent in putting them up in the fall or whenever they were in season. So
Do you
yeah.
utilize juniper berries for like medicine and stuff, or?
uh that's a really good question. I do utilize juniper berries a good deal. I don't know if I've ever even looked up if they are good for a specific malady. One thing I always stress in both my herbalist classes, like medicinal classes, or my foraging classes, is that Venn diagram of medicine and food. It's really easy in our Western culture to think, oh, this is food over here, and that's medicine over there. Um, and I think at a certain level we know better, but if you have scurvy, then oranges aren't just food, that's medicine. You're getting vitamin C because your condition is a vitamin C deficiency. And I mean, although it pains me to say it, if
Food
you're
is medicine.
severely
Yeah.
if you're severely malnourished, Twinkies are a medicine, because that's what your body needs right then. So I do use juniper berries a lot in wild game cooking mostly. I also put them in homemade sauerkraut, which is like a traditional German preparation for sauerkraut.
Really?
Yeah, yep.
I
The
did
throwing
not
juniper
know
berries.
that.
Yep, yeah. It's funny because whenever I come across an eastern red cedar, which is a misnomer because it's actually a juniper. I point out the berries to people, and almost right away people are like, gin, and that's absolutely right. That's you flavor vodka with juniper berries, and you've got gin. And not terribly long ago, a few hundred years ago, it was a medicine,
Right.
and then of course people started to abuse medicine, as people do. I mean, you have to look no further than the most recent headlines on the opioid crisis to see that times don't necessarily change. But you know, it wasn't terribly long ago that if something ailed you, you went to the pharmacist and got yourself some gin for to take care of whatever particular problem you had. So
Yeah. I think like certain types of infections, like within, I want to say like maybe the kidneys or the urinary tract or something like that, is like what juniper berries are like good for, but they're also like the same time too much can be damaging to your kidneys and
oh
stuff too. So it's like there's that fine line that you better know what you're doing
yeah,
before you fully utilize their full potential to heal yourself when it comes to that. Like
yeah,
there's
yeah.
some of those that you come across where it's like, oh yeah, we use it when we're cooking, and it's like those small doses, the micro doses of something that could be bad is actually good for you. But then when you take it to that next level, it could potentially harm you or do, renal failure or something like that. So,
Yeah, absolutely. Although it's funny because nutmeg is not really that different either.
yeah,
It a lot of these things too. A lot of people will crush a juniper berry. They'll smell it. They'll think it's pleasant. They might try it. They might find it s- pleasantly flavored, but very strong. A lot of these medicinals and edibles for that matter. they've got their own mechanisms to prevent us from, chowing down too much on them. And I don't know too many people that would really want to have more than, a half dozen to a dozen crushed juniper berries
Right.
in their venison, along with their venison pot roast, because it would start to give it a flavor that would go from pleasant to just a bit too much
Yeah.
really quickly. So
Definitely over herbaceous or what savory.
yeah, resinous.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
the like yarrow, I mean, I don't find that taste to be pleasant whatsoever, but at the same time, it's in your head, it's like, well, I know it's good for me. So, like dried yarrow to me is okay, but if you eat like fresh yarrow and just take like a small handful of it and put it in your mouth and chew it, it is not pleasant.
Yeah, yeah. And one thing too is everybody's different. So, I've talked to people where they don't mind it at all. And then of course drying it is totally different too, because sweet fern is something that I'm very fond of making infusions with. And the dry herb is, for me, is really pleasant. And if I use the fresh herb, it'll give me a little bit of an upset stomach. And I've talked to some other people and they're like, really? I've never had that experience at all. It's like, it's just me. Maybe it's just me, or maybe I haven't run into anybody else who's had that issue. But
Yeah,
everybody's different like that.
it's interesting. But so yeah, that was kind of what I wanted to ask you, and I don't want to drag it on too long because I know we could talk forever. So
For sure.
before we go, I just kind of want to ask you, and that way all the listeners can know too, where can they find you, reach out to you, maybe take some classes from you, and all that good kind of stuff as well.
Oh, absolutely. So I do classes through eagleoutdoorskills.com. That's where I post the classes that I run myself. And then of course I can be found on social media. I've got a Facebook page, Eagle Outdoor Skills, and an Instagram, Eagle_outdoor_skills at Instagram. So that's where you can find me on those platforms. And then also, just if someone tracks me down, I'm often all too happy to talk about this stuff. So, any which way that people can get a hold of me. I also teach classes at functions like the Midwest Fall Harvest Festival, and some folk schools hire me to teach classes there, such as Folklore Village in Dodgeville, Wisconsin, and other places. So I should probably start putting those places up on my website so people can go through there too to find those offerings. So
Yeah, that's awesome. I
yeah,
appreciate it. Thank you so
yeah.
much for coming on, sharing, and it was great.
Oh, it's been a real pleasure. It's been great talking to you, Luke.
Thanks. And once again, thank you so much for listening to the Publicly Challenged podcast. I hope you enjoyed the show, and if you did, please subscribe on whatever platform it is you're listening to. Also, if you could leave a review, that would help us out. And you can check us out on Instagram or at publiclychallenged.com. And once again, thank you so much for listening to the show.